Moving on, it is now time to present the second speaker of the day in this gender and sexuality panel. And it is my pleasure to introduce to you Nuria Singenberger, who holds a bachelor's degree in the study of religion and Norse studies from the University of Basel. Nuria's research interests center around current phenomena within Western esotericism, especially concerning the reception of ancient and medieval history and literature, such as within Neopaganism. And the title of her presentation is The Binding of Loki, Discourses on Loki in North American Heathenry. Nuria, you have the floor.
Good morning, and thank you very much for the opportunity of presenting my paper today at the student conference. I'm going to jump right in yes, it works. First of all, I'm just going to give a short explanation of what heathenry is so that we're all on the same page. Heathenry is a subgroup of the umbrella term of Neopaganism, which of course denotes various new religious movements that take inspiration from pre-Christian religions. Heathenry specifically is notable for its almost exclusive worship of Germanic gods, or that's at least what practitioners often claim. And it is also more reconstructionist than other neo-pagan movements. What that means, what reconstructionism means, is that practitioners follow the narrative that they want to reconstruct the pre-Christian religion. They want to follow as closely as possible. This is, of course, a religious narrative, and from a scholarly perspective, it's basically possible to do that because we don't really know very much about many of the religions that were practiced by people in Germanic regions before Christianity. And of course, many of the things that we do know would not be compatible with modern day society. This problem for heathens is solved by them practicing in what I would call a kind of exegetical culture, which is that they read a lot of medieval texts, especially Old Norse texts from Iceland, that concern the pre-Christian religion, and they read them a bit like Christians read scripture, analyzing and finding points in these texts that serve them as arguments for what to practice or why they should practice or believe a certain thing. Heathenry is politically very diverse and somewhat controversial because there is a small minority of far-right individuals that use heathenry as an argument for far-right political concerns. This is also tied to the complicated history of the movement, which I will get into a bit later. My paper analyzes specifically the debate around Loki, which is a debate within modern heathenry, especially in the United States, where Loki is either worshipped ardently or seen as an incredibly negative force. I argue in my paper that the debate around Loki is not simply theological in the sense that the texts say that Loki is a negative entity, but that the debate about Loki is very much political and rooted in political narratives from today and the past few centuries, which is especially with regards to gender and sexuality, as we will see. So firstly, I will show you a few examples of how Loki is construed as the enemy. Then I will show you how Loki is construed as a worshipped god. And afterwards, I will try and put this into a historical and political context. So first of all, let's see Loki as the enemy. This view is especially pronounced in far-right groups, such as the Odinic Right, the Circle of Astora, or the Alsa Folk Assembly, short AFA. And here the general idea is that Loki is an enemy of the natural order of things, not just in terms of gender, but in general. And so the Odinic Right, for instance, sees Loki as a hindrance to reaching the Odin consciousness. They see him as a sort of way of physical pleasure, whereas what they call the Odin consciousness is some sort of divine realization to them. So I quote here, Loki is a counterfeit pleasure that stops people from reaching divine bliss, as a quote. Of course, Loki, with this idea of sexual pleasure or pleasure in general, is very much connected for them to sexual deviance. Here I have a quote from a book from a Gothi, so a priest from the Alsa Folk Assembly, Mark per year. And he says about Loki, I quote, Loki is the Jotun of unbridled lust and bisexuality, whose antics are shown within our law to consume him within his own morass of degrading behavior. Prier also does not only see Loki himself as an entity, as this negative force, but he also associates many of his devotees with various negative attributes. So he claims that, and here I quote, his Lokian devotees are prone to drug abuse, alcoholism, laziness, and arrogance. All of this, of course, then is connected to ideas of quote-unquote binding Loki. This is a reference to a myth where Loki, after having done a lot of shenanigans with the gods and having done a lot of misdeeds, is bound by the gods to a rock, and a snake is above him, dropping poison over him, and only his wife, Sigyn, tries to help him and puts a bowl over him so that the poison won't drop on him. And so many of the ideas here also that people who see Loki as this type of enemy, they want to bind Loki and they want to stop quote unquote the children of Loki, meaning devotees, but also people who follow certain ideas that they connect to Loki, wanting to bind them, wanting to stop them. And this is kind of why they want to stop Loki. Now let's move on to Loki as a worshipped entity. A lot of people who worship Loki, or for whom Loki has a central place in their spiritual practice, call themselves Lokians. Lokians are much less group organized than the people we've seen before, so they don't have specific websites or books written by priests by them. My main source here for this, therefore, was Tumblr, which is a web page where a lot of neo-pagans post things about their religion. What is already interesting to note is that many of the devotees of Loki that I've encountered on these websites are part of the LGBTQ plus community, and they conceptualize Loki as a queer god as well. But here, of course, in a more positive light than the groups we've discussed before. Here, an example for this is a devotional poem that somebody posted on this webpage. Interestingly, Loki here is sort of implied to, or not just implied, but is said to transgress and, of course, defy binary categories, especially such categories as male and female. So he is described as, I quote, the son of Laufey, the daughter of Farbauti, the mother of Sleipnir, and the father of Hel. And the poem ends, of course, with praising Loki, saying, "Hail to you, queer god, hail to he who will not be kept in place, hail to she who crosses all boundaries, hail to day who defines all binaries." This is also a devotional piece that somebody else drew that fits this description quite perfectly. Of course, we can here see a very androgynous Loki figure with both female and male features. We also see these are his children. So we have, of course, his monstrous children from mythology as well that kind of manifest out of his womb, I suppose. So we have here, for instance, the Fenris wolf, the wall serpent Jörmungandr, his daughter Hel, who is half dead, half alive. And here, for instance, the horse Sleipnir, to which Loki is in fact a mother, because in a myth he turned into a mare and seduced a stallion, and thus was Sleipnir conceived. The title is also very interesting, Devotional Piece for Loki, Mother of Monsters and All of His Children. Mother of Monsters is an epithet that many of modern Loki devotees use to describe Loki, and they kind of conceptualize themselves a bit as monsters, especially if they're transgressive to normative society, and so they see Loki kind of as their mother or protectress, so as a protectress of minorities. This is also very present in another text where Loki is really conceptualized as the mother and protectress of people from various minority groups. Here, the text does not only talk about people from the LGBTQ plus community, but also people of color, people who are poor, and a general huge variety of people who come from minorities. The text here claims that Loki is with those, I quote, who are abandoned, shunned, and forgotten. And also, the text conceptualizes Loki as a protector of all of these people. Here, another quote, he protests for them, he fights for them in the government, demanding funding for shelters, demanding respect, demanding that they be seen as the victims of the society around them, assigning a low value to their existence and not their intrinsic worth. So we have seen that Loki is either seen as very negative or very positive, and but in all these movements he's seen as rather queer or transgressive with regards to gender. And so I just want to make a shortly look at the theological underpinnings of this debate and looking at what the ancient texts actually say. So we see the medieval sources, and in these sources, Loki is generally extremely ambivalent, neither good or bad. Even in the sources where he's described as rather negative, he always ends up helping the gods in some way or another and is never really quite a villain. What's also especially interesting that yes, in the original sources, Loki's gender and sexuality are indeed extremely fluid. This is especially notable with the word ergi or arker being the adjective, and Loki is described with these words. And this word denotes femininity, as well as having connotations to passive anal sex. Loki, as I already mentioned, is also the mother of the horse Sleipnir, and he lived for 9 years as a milkmaid in Utgard. What is particularly interesting as well is a pronoun change in the poem Þrymskviða, where Loki and Thor dress up. Thor has to begrudgingly dress up as a bride, and Loki volunteers to be his bridesmaid. Interestingly, when they're both dressed up, Thor's pronouns remain male, whereas Loki's pronouns, as soon as he's dressed up as a bridesmaid, are continuously female, and she's a she then. But this still doesn't explain everything, because the same holds true for Odin. Odin is also called Erki. He also practices the what is called women's magic, so he practices Sæðir, for which he's also criticized, and he dressed up in women's clothes on several occasions. But yet still, he's not as vitally associated with queerness as Loki within modern heathenry. And I think the reason for this is very much rooted in more modern narratives. And for this, I also looked at the book by George L. Mosse, The Image of Man, The Creation of Modern Masculinity. And here he describes in more general the idea of the ideal man and its antithesis that is used as or seen as a kind of threat to normative society. And the antithesis to the ideal man he analyzes is a homogenized, stereotypical image of several marginalized groups, such as Jews, queer people, mentally ill people, people with disabilities, and so on. And he claims that there is a special focus on gender deviance. I'm just going to show one quote of how he sees this. So, it was the so-called unmanly men, however, who provoked perhaps the deepest anxiety among those who were part of normative society, and who, while possessing all the traits of outsiders, in addition seemed to have crossed the barrier of gender. We have seen how in times of insecurity, strong lines of demarcation between genders were considered essential. Blurring the division between them seemed to conjure up the specter of anarchy. And this perfectly ties into the reception of Norse mythology, as well as the history of modern day heathenry. Of course, the reception of Norse mythology became especially popular in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, and was closely connected to national romanticism and nation building. Not only the Scandinavian nations, of course, started to be very fascinated with Old Norse texts, but also Germany and England had a very strong obsession with the image of the Viking. And of course, this also connected to notions of manliness, seeing the perfect man, the noble Viking going to battle, being very manly, being fearless. And sadly, of course, these narratives in a way culminated in the propaganda of National Socialism, where, of course, the idea of Germanic religion, Old Norse religion, was very popular and connected to these ideals, which, of course, also resulted in funding of a lot of scholarship in this direction during this time. An interesting note here as well is that Loki was often portrayed as Jewish since the 19th century, which also ties into this idea of Loki kind of being the transgressive representative of the other or the minority groups. This also further ties into the history of modern day heathenry in the United States, because the first heathen group that arrived in the United States was the Edenic Right, which we already seen has very far right leanings. The founder, Elsa Christensen, was inspired by the Australian Nazi sympathizer Alexander Radmils, who aspired to combine Old Norse mythology with Nazi ideology. And so it is extremely or very probable that the inspiration for the Loki reception today stems more from these things than only from a reception of Old Norse texts, and that Loki is seen as a queer deity as well, especially because of this, albeit there being, of course, clear reasons we can find in Old Norse texts as well. Of course, to conclude this a bit, narratives of the monstrous are not only part of heathenry, and it's a general tactic or narratological strategy that people describe what they see as transgressive as monstrous. We can see this in the United States, also in other conservative discourses. Here, for instance, the conservative politician Robert Bork on feminism, using Christian imagery, the rough beast of decadence, a long time in gestation, having reached its maturity in the last 3 decades, now sends us slouching towards our new home, not Bethlehem, but Gomorrah. So we can see this, of course, is a very common narratological strategy. As we have seen, the discourse about Loki is a symptom of bigger discourses and bigger issues, and it's very much tied to storytelling and identity. Who am I as a person? Who are we as a community? And how do we deal with these changes in society? I think society changing a lot, of course, catalyzes this. And having not just these political causes in the grand scheme, we can see that this discourse on Loki also shows how neopaganism and heathenry are continuously changing and developing. And as new religious movements, of course, I think this is even much faster than with other religions that have, for instance, canonized ideas and purposes. And so the issue with Loki is very much tied also to changes in society and in these religious movements themselves. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I'm open and ready for questions.